The other day, I was standing outside the ticket gate in Shinjuku Station in Tokyo and started to watch an ad for Mexican avocados on one of the nearby screens. At first, it looked to me like your standard Japanese commercial. There was the dancing kawaii mascot surrounded by talent, making their emotive and gesticulations to the superlative. But when the ad started to repeat itself, it was on an endless kind of loop, I realized just how utterly insane the current iteration of Western culture is. And even though I myself think that much of the current zeitgeist is nothing more than masochistic mental diarrhea, that I too now notice what they want me to notice. Now, let me explain. What I notice is that many of us have gone quite literally insane and see everything about Western civilization in need of deconstructing. Of the many new concepts that have been introduced over this past decade, things like microaggressions, privilege, whiteness, or whatever the latest phobia that has been concocted, plus a slew of other self-imposed victimhood-related terminology is, what I have come to realize over the past several years is that this mental affliction is suffered by only one culture, and that is the Western culture. To the rest of the world, when you try to explain these things to people in places like Burma, in India, in Tokyo, or in Seoul, they think that Western people have lost their collective cultural sanity. And we have. While watching the ad for Mexican avocados in a train station in Tokyo, I realized how such an advert would send the very vocal minority of the professionally offended back in Western countries into meltdown mode. You see, the ad has a couple of women and kids dancing with men in the background. All of them are wearing traditional Mexican outfits, but when you look at the people in those costumes, you'll see that they are clearly Japanese people, and they are Japanese people that are wearing the sombreros. You see, in the newly minted cult of woke that is based on ever-stretched definitions of victimhood, the Japanese in this ad have reduced the poor Mexican people and their culture down to a costume and a dancing avocado, and they will squeal and bemoan this victimization of the Mexican people and of their culture being appropriated. Thing is, outside of the Western world, nobody cares about this kind of mental gymnastics that are the symptoms of a larger desire to dismantle everything Western, to turn the world into the binary of oppressor and oppressed, victim and victimizer. This is the worldview of the people that hate everything about their own culture and society. And strangely enough, this venom, this seething contempt, this desire to deconstruct everything and anything with regards to Western society by these people is directly related to the overwhelming success of Western culture. This is a worldview that shares aspects of xenophilia to the detriment of reality, but would more accurately be called oikophobia, or an aversion to home surroundings. And this aversion is reaching a virtue-signaling cacophony within the culture of woke as they seek to deconstruct every aspect of Western society, and at the same time they're doing this, have absolutely nothing to replace it with.
Gaius grew up in Rome doing menial jobs and a lot of drinking. Like millions of poor Romans, he lived on welfare handouts of grain and mindless distraction, lots of it. Intent on distracting themselves, most Romans didn't notice the social fabric of their empire shredding all around them. Rome's sense of community had disappeared. The elite were increasingly isolated from the poor. Educated Romans were turning their backs on everything to do with old Rome, not just the poor. The East, ancient, mysterious, and exotic, seemed much more enticing. Wealthy Romans headed off to see the sights of Egypt. The world's first tourist boom had begun. The Roman delight in far-flung places was not reciprocated. As Rome thrilled to the exotic East was starting to hate Rome's guts. In the provinces and periphery of empire, resentment festered.
Does any of this summary of the decline of the Roman Empire sound at all similar to our present circumstances? While history doesn't repeat, it does rhyme. Like the Romans of old, many in our society now see all things Western as inherently corrupt. Our history is one of oppression, and all the world is our victim. In his 2004 book, England and the Need for Nations, British philosopher Roger Scruton defines oikophobia as the repudiation of inheritance and home. He argued that it's a stage through which the adolescent mind normally passes, but that it's a feature of some, typically leftists, political impulses and ideologies, which espouse xenophilia, or the preference for alien cultures. He also said that oikophobia is an extreme aversion to the sacred and the thwarting of the connection of the sacred to the culture of the West, and it's described as the underlying motif of oikophobia, and not the substitution of Judeo-Christianity by another coherent system of belief. The paradox of oikophobia seems to be that any opposition directed at the theological and cultural traditions of the West is to be encouraged, even if it is significantly more parochial, exclusivist, patriarchal, and ethnocentric. Scruton described a chronic form of oikophobia that has spread through the American universities in the guise of political correctness, and that oikophobia is the felt need to denigrate the customs, cultures, and institutions that are identifiably ours. That is, the rank-and-file oikophobic will celebrate others' cultures even if the sacred, the customs, and practices of that culture go against their own woke values because of their deep-seated rejection of all things Western. Many of you listening to this might be aware of the recent SAS Airlines ad that basically said that the entire region of Scandinavia has no culture, but they only appropriated everything they have from others, and that Vikings are actually the ancestors of all the people that live there, regardless of their origin. Well, this was utterly repudiated by the public to the extent the ad was first pulled and then republished on social media with the comment section, of course, turned off. And incidents like this are now a staple for the past several years. From the demand to erase history because it's not comporting with 21st century woke oikophobia, we have seen the removal of Confederate statues in the United States, as well as statues and his image on the $10 note of the first Prime Minister of Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald. Even classical literature is seemingly now problematic for the cult of woke, so much so that classic books like Frankenstein and The Three Musketeers are now apparently too white. To fight back against this, in February 2020, publisher Penguin Random House and retailer Barnes & Noble teamed up for this year's Black History Month to literally slap classic books with blackface. In Texas, the State Board of Education there, back in 2018, took to basically rewriting the history of the Alamo, as the use of lines that referred to the soldiers who fought there at the Alamo as heroic defenders was problematic for them. I could cite example after example after example. Please add some that you know of in the comment section, but I think you all know what's going on. But we have looked on, many of us have looked on, in amazement at some of the glaring hypocrisy of much that is spouted by the oikophobic believers in the Church of Woke. How else, people wonder, could you ever explain a situation where radical oikophobes calling on a planned LGBT parade party through a Western city as provocative and calling for counter-demonstrators because the LGBT participants are perhaps conservative and the neighborhood they might pass through would be majority Muslim? Many people think that these people are simply mad or utter hypocrites. You can think of their self-righteous hatred that knows no bounds, but in a twisted way, it does make sense. No, really, this does make sense. Let me explain. There's an interesting article written by Benedict Beckeld entitled Oikophobia, Our Western Self-Hatred, where he delineates the decline of the Western world as one that no longer believes in its culture or its history, and explains that this self-hatred is an oft-repeated historical process that takes a society from naive and self-promoting beginnings to self-contempt and decline. Like Spengler, he believes that human cultures operate in cycles, basically the oft-repeated line that hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. In that, after the pinnacle of a culture's life cycle during its decline is when oikophobia sets in, and for this reason, this is why we are seeing so much destabilization and polarization today in the West. He believes that the current gratuitous form of oikophobia practiced by much of the people in the West today has its roots in the post-World War II era, and he illustrates it as thus. Diverse interests are created that view each other as greater enemies than they do foreign threats. Since the common civilizational enemy has been successfully repulsed, it can no longer serve as an effective target for and outlet of people's sense of superiority, and human psychology generally requires an adversary for the purposes of self-identification, and so a new adversary is crafted: other people in the same civilization. Since this condition of leisure and empowerment, as well as the perception of external threats as non-existential, are the result of a society's success, success is, ironically, a prerequisite for society's self-hatred. What Freud has called the narcissism of small differences in civilization and its discontents, the urge to compete against others, even through minor distinctions, like a virtuous action or the newest gadget, becomes one motivation through which a particular interest expresses its superiority over others. This domestic competition means that by rejecting one's own cultural background as being backward, one automatically sets oneself above all other interests that are part of that culture. And this is why in cultures that celebrate oikophobia, you will not only see the racism of lower expectations constantly, but also the growing industry of professionally offended, creating an ever-dizzying array of ways to separate people, to tribalize them, to group them against each other. The current iteration of oikophobia is not one based on xenophilia, but one that is based on projecting one's self-hatred onto other members of the same culture as a way to define oneself as different and better than others. The key here is that once we understand the reoccurring historical context of oikophobia and how it has reanimated in our own society, and that this expression of social justice, as it's called, is not based on any kind of new or revealed truth, as many in the cult of woke believe, but it's nothing more than a leisured and bored class of people of an overwhelmingly successful society that seek to overthrow everything sacred and deconstruct every aspect of their own society. Oikophobia is but a symptom of the pathology of a successful society in decline. And once we understand this, we're better able to understand those that seemingly express contradictory and hypocritical calls for victimhood when they do so in our everyday lives. Oikophobes are basically virtue signaling their first world problems. Now, with all of that said, I think that we can learn some very important lessons on this issue from the Orient and Japan in particular. Now, while the country does have a low birth rate and many of the other problems that plague other developed countries, the Japanese are still very prideful of their culture, their country, and their history. Japanese are, in fact, quite obsessed with what they believe to be their own uniqueness. While still being able to interface with the world and take the best of what it has to offer, the Japanese are in no way ashamed of their own success, nor feel the need to deconstruct their own society to atone for perceived historical wrongs. Like the Mexican avocado ad, the Japanese have not taken the oikophobia pill and display that year-round. As many of you know, I've uploaded videos of interesting traditional Japanese festivals given a modern singe, as well as imported festivals like Christmas and Halloween given a Japanese tinge. The point is, wealth alone is not what invites this socially destructive pathology into one's culture. People can be interested in other cultures and have a desire to learn from them. I would say I fit in this category, as I myself am an expat living in the Orient. I find I enjoy nothing more than to immerse myself in other exotic cultures, as it were. But that doesn't mean that I've forgotten or feel disdain for my own. Quite the contrary, in fact. It's been the living abroad and the immersion in other societies where I think that I have found my great affinity, not only for traditional Western culture and history, but also of Western achievement. Mistakes, of course, have been made. There's not a single person or group of people that have not made mistakes, but Western people have nothing to apologize for. A balance between appreciating the other while also simultaneously appreciating one's own culture is what it would appear Westerners in general have a hard time balancing. In this, we could definitely learn from the Japanese, and the Taiwanese, and the South Koreans, among others. Because there's nothing wrong with cute dancing avocados flanked by Japanese people wearing sombreros. Only a society gone totally mad could ever come up with something as ludicrous as cultural appropriation, and I think it's time that we need to take the role. We in the West need to take the role of pupil to the Far Eastern sensei, at least on this matter. That's it. That's the end. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this kind of material, please consider subscribing here, as well as at my second channel, Black Pigeon Speaks, and also on BitChute, which is currently the only free speech platform for videos on the internet. Links are in the description. Again, thanks very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.